All right, so for today, we're going to be looking only at Act 1, Scene 3. And the reason that this is the only one we're going to look at is because it's going to take us a little bit of time to do it. So we're going to skip this first part as far as taking notes. I just want to point out, whenever the witches are there in the very beginning of this scene, you go back to Scene 1 and remember that they said they're going to meet again after the battle, which we know is over, but before sunset, to meet Macbeth. And so here they are, they've met again, so we know that they're getting ready to meet Macbeth. And their conversation here really just shows us, because they talk about how they got mad at a sailor's wife, so they're going to curse his ship, and it just really gives us an idea of how mischievous they are. All right, now this part right here, so here's the part where Macbeth enters. Macbeth and Banquo, they're both generals in the army. So Macbeth and Banquo enter. Now the witch is already there, so they enter. And Macbeth says, "I have never seen a day that was so good and bad at the same time." So you can think it's good, they won the battle. It's bad because, think about, there's thunder and lightning, so there's that bad weather. Also, maybe they lost some men. They had some traitors that betrayed King Duncan. So he's saying that it's good and bad. All right, then Banquo speaks up here. And when Banquo speaks up, he acknowledges the witches. And after he acknowledges the witches, Macbeth says, "Speak if you can." Now, this is where things start to get very important for you to pay attention to. Okay? So let's look here. The three witches hail Macbeth as three different titles. So they say, "Hail Macbeth, hail to you, Thane of Glamis." Now, being a Thane, I've talked about this already, but being a Thane is nobility in Scotland. The second witch says, "Hail to thee, Macbeth, hail to you, Thane of Cawdor." Remember this from Scene 2. And then the third witch says, "Hail to you, future king." So I want to remind you that, remember when we had Scene 2 and we finished it and I said, guys, it's really important for you to understand that we have dramatic irony. Because the second witch says, "Hail to you, Thane of Cawdor," but dramatic irony, we know that Macbeth has been named Thane of Cawdor, but Macbeth doesn't know that yet. All right, so let's look at Banquo's part. He says, "Macbeth, why do you look so startled?" And the way Shakespeare wrote it is, "Why do you start and seem to fear things that sound so fair?" The way that we have it in our side-by-side, it says, "Why do you look so startled and afraid?" All right, so why are you startled and afraid? All right, and then Banquo says, if you can tell us the future, why do you not say anything to me? So this next part is going to be where they talk to Banquo. So the witches tell Banquo two things. They say that he's lesser than Macbeth, but also greater, not as happy, yet much happier. All right, so these are what we call a paradox. Because whenever you first look at it, it seems to be a contradiction. How can he be lesser and greater? How can he be not as happy, yet much happier? So, we're going to talk about one of them now, and then we're going to pay attention to the remainder of the play to figure out the second one. So how can he be lesser and greater at the same time? He can be lesser because what do we know about Macbeth? We know that he's gotten these new titles. So maybe Banquo's lesser in rank. But then they say that he's greater. So what can he be greater in? He might be greater in character. He might be greater in his bravery or loyalty or whatever. So he can be lesser in rank but greater as a person. And just as the third witch is the one who told Macbeth, "You will be king in the future," the third witch tells Banquo, "Your descendants will be kings even though you will not be one." So this is a big deal. Banquo's descendants, his sons, will be kings even though he is not going to be one. So the witches have told Banquo and Macbeth some details that you need to make sure that you understand because it's going to be very important as we read this play. So Macbeth's part right here is very important, and we're looking at this portion right here. This part right here is very important because, again, we have dramatic irony. All right, so with the dramatic irony here, he says, "Tell me more. I already know," and I'm going to switch up colors just a little bit to make it easier. He says, "I already know I am Thane of Glamis because I inherited the position. But how can I be the Thane of Cawdor? The Thane of Cawdor is alive, and he is a rich and powerful man." There's our dramatic irony. Because we know what the Thane of Cawdor has done. But Macbeth doesn't know that. So Macbeth, to him, the Thane of Cawdor is still a rich and powerful man. And then he says, "To be king is completely impossible, just as it's impossible for me to be Thane of Cawdor." So he is thinking in terms of, there's no way for me to be Thane of Cawdor, but there's also no way for me to be king. And he's putting them almost at that same level of possibility, which is going to be important in just a minute. So this next part that we're going to look at is the witches vanish, and Macbeth and Banquo are mainly talking about what they said about being king and Macbeth being Thane of Cawdor. So let's look at this part right here. Enter Ross and Angus. What can you predict at this point? What do we know Ross has been sent to do? If you remember at the end of scene 2, King Duncan sent Ross to get Macbeth and to announce the execution of the Thane of Cawdor and to give Macbeth the title. So this part right here with Ross, he just talks about how the king was happy to hear of your success. He's so amazed. Then go down a little bit further. That the messenger after messenger delivered the news of your bravery to the king. So he's just talking about how King Duncan has heard so much about Macbeth's bravery in battle. All right, so on this part, Angus says, "Your real reward won't come from us." And that's where Ross gives him the news that he told me to call you the Thane of Cawdor. So hail, Thane of Cawdor, that title now belongs to you. All right, well, look at Banquo. Banquo is shocked. He says, "Can the devil tell the truth?" Because what did they just find out? They just found out that the witches saying that he'd be Thane of Cawdor was truth. Now, this part right here, he says, the Thane of Cawdor is still alive. There's your dramatic irony again. Why are you putting his clothes on me? Now, he does not literally mean, why are you putting his clothes on me? Look at how it's worded in the Shakespeare version. Why do you dress me in borrowed robes? So does he really mean, why are you putting his robes on me? No, this is, I'm going to put the notes over here. This is a metaphor. And you have to figure out what is being compared. He says robes, and I'm going to use robes here. I'm going to use robes instead of clothes because I think that's a better indication of nobility. But he says, why do you put borrowed robes on me? And what he really means is the title. Why are you calling me by someone else's title? And that's where Angus gives him the news. He says, the man who was Thane of Cawdor is still alive, but he has been sentenced to death, and he deserves to die. And then he kind of just talks to him about what the Thane of Cawdor did. He says he fought on Norway's side, secretly aided the rebels. He fought with both of our enemies. So Angus gives him that news that the Thane of Cawdor is going to be sentenced to death because he fought with the enemies of Scotland. So you can start to see what Macbeth is finding out here. And it comes immediately after the witches told him, Thane of Glamis, Thane of Cawdor, future king. And he's like, well, it's not possible. I'm not going to be king, just like I'm never going to be Lord of Cawdor or Thane of Cawdor. So whenever he's in his mind, it's not possible to be either one. And then immediately Ross comes in and says, but you are going to be Thane of Cawdor. The title is now yours. And Macbeth is like, okay, so they were telling the truth when they said I was going to be Thane of Cawdor. And you can start to predict what is about to happen once he finds out that he's Thane of Cawdor, because his mindset was, I can't be king just like I can't be Thane of Cawdor. All right, so this next part, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the terms. So if you notice, right here it says Macbeth to himself. And then down here it says speaking so that only Banquo can hear. So you're looking at those two things. Notice what it's really called. It's called an aside. And an aside is when there are several characters on stage, but a character is going to think aloud, which talking to himself, thinking aloud, or talking to another character, but the others cannot hear. So whenever this is being said to him, so when it says to himself, you have to remember that even though Macbeth, Banquo, Ross, and Angus are all on the stage, they are not hearing what Macbeth is saying right here. And that can get confusing if you don't pay attention to the fact that it's an aside. All right, so Macbeth says, it's just like they said. Who's they? The witches, right? It's just like they said. I am now Thane of Glamis, Thane of Cawdor, and the best part of what they predicted is still to come. What is the best part of what they predicted? Being king. So what is he thinking at this point? He's thinking, guess what? I'm Thane of Glamis, Thane of Cawdor. What they said was true. And if what they said was true about being Thane of Cawdor, then what they said about me being king can also be true. All right, and then he starts talking to Banquo, and he says, aren't you beginning to hope your children will be kings? That's what the witches said. All right, so this next part, I think, really starts to show us one thing we're going to be looking at whenever we go back and we analyze Macbeth, is we're going to look at how Banquo is the conscience in the play. He's the conscience in the play. He's that sense of right and wrong for Macbeth. And I feel like this is the first time we really see Banquo as the conscience. He says, if you trust what they say, you might be on your way to becoming king, as well as Thane of Cawdor. But this whole thing is strange. The agents of evil. Who are the agents of evil in this play? The witches. All right, so he's trying to warn him that the agents of evil often tell us part of the truth in order to lead us to our destruction. They earn our trust by telling us the truth about little things, but then they betray us when it will damage us the most. All right, so let's look at how Shakespeare wrote it. To win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness tell us truths. They win us with honest trifles to betray us into deepest consequences. So I want to look at the way Shakespeare wrote it. So they're trying to, so the instruments of darkness are the witches. And he's trying to warn him that the instruments of darkness tell us the truths. And I'm going to switch colors so that we don't get confused. So what's the truth that they told Macbeth? They told him he would be glamorous, which he already is, and Cawdor. So whenever he says, what if the witches told you the truth that you would be Thane of Cawdor, they won you over with this honest trifle, which is a small truth. And it's the small truth is that he would be Thane of Cawdor. But what might they be trying to do? Betray him into deepest consequences. So, what is the deepest consequence they might be trying to betray him to do? And then what they might be trying to get him to do is something evil to become king. So here Banquo is acting as the conscience. He's trying to warn Macbeth, what if the witches told you the small truth that you were going to be Thane of Cawdor because they're trying to trick you into doing something evil to become king? So this is Banquo's warning. So Banquo is giving Macbeth a warning here. And we're going to pay attention to how this plays out. All right, so if we move down a little bit further, this is where we start to see a little bit more of Macbeth's thought process. This is Macbeth speaking right here. So this is Macbeth. He says, thank you, gentlemen. He's talking to Ross and Angus. Then back to himself, back to an aside. He says, this supernatural temptation doesn't seem like it can be bad. Notice it says, doesn't seem like it can be bad. So really, what is he saying? He's saying, it's a good thing. But he says, but it can't be good either. So he's saying, it can't be bad, but it can't be good. Then let's look at what he means by that. He says, if it is bad, why was I promised the promotion that turned out to be true? So the promotion that turned out to be true, don't get tricked by this. It says, if it is a bad thing, why was I promised a promotion that would be true? So he's really saying that this is the good. That's how it's good. But then he says, now I'm the Thane of Cawdor, just like they said I would be. But if this is a good thing, so it's the question, if it's a good thing, why do I find myself thinking about murdering King Duncan? So this is why he thinks it's a bad thing, because it's making him think of murder. Now, even though he's thinking about murdering King Duncan, it's very important for you to see what he thinks about that. He says that it's a thought so horrifying, and let me erase that so you can see a little bit better. He says it's a thought so horrifying that it makes my hair stand on end. So the thought of murder that he says is, it's a terrible thing. It's horrifying that I'm thinking about murdering King Duncan. So even though he's thinking about it, he knows it's a bad thought. And I mean, kind of put yourself in this position. I'm sure you've had moments in your past where you thought something. And you thought it, but then you were like, oh, that's a terrible thought. How could I think something like that? And that's what's happening to Macbeth. The thought of murder entered his mind, but then he was like, oh, that's a horrifying thought. I can't believe I thought that. And that's where he is at that point. So even though he thought about murder, we can see that he's still a genuinely good person because he considers it a horrifying thought and he doesn't want to think that. Okay. All right, so this next part right here, he says, if fate wants me to be king, perhaps fate will just make it happen and I won't have to do anything. Let's look at how Shakespeare wrote it. If chance will have me king, chance may crown me without my stir. Or without my stir, meaning I wouldn't have to do anything. So this is, I like the way Shakespeare wrote it here. This is personification. All right, so this is personification. Because what is he saying? He says that chance, and the way that he words it over there, is fate. So chance or fate will crown him. All right, so chance or fate will crown him. Well, chance, fate, those are not people. That's, that is a thing. So it can't literally crown him, but he's giving it the qualities of a person that it could choose to have him crowned. All right. So let's look at this next thing. Banquo. Okay, so you have to imagine what this is like. Banquo, Ross, and Angus, they've kind of been to the side, having their own conversation. Macbeth has been saying all of this stuff, but remember it's an aside. They cannot hear. So it's Macbeth thinking to himself. So imagine what it would be like if you're over to the side thinking to yourself. To them, it looks like Macbeth is just kind of out there, is thinking. So Banquo says, Macbeth is not used to his new titles. They are like new clothes. They don't fit until you break them in over time. Okay? And then you can look at how Shakespeare wrote it over here. Strange garments cleave not to their mold, but with the aid of use. So this is, by the way, a simile, because he's comparing the new title to new clothes. All right? So he's comparing the new title to new clothes. And we know, and by the way, dramatic irony again, we know that Macbeth's thinking about murdering King Duncan. But the way that they're seeing it is Macbeth is thinking about the title that he just received. He's beyond that part. He's already thinking about becoming king. All right, so the last little bit of what we had to read for that scene was simply them saying, okay, let's go on. So now what I'm going to do is I have these 4 boxes, and we're going to go through and we're going to look at how one thing leads to another. So the first thing that we have is that the witches held Macbeth as Thane of Glam, Thane of Cawdor, and future king. Then, after that happens, Ross tells Macbeth he is now Thane of Cawdor. Once Ross tells Macbeth that he is now Thane of Cawdor, Macbeth actually believes that he can also be king. And once he starts believing that he can actually be king, guess what happens? He considers murdering King Duncan, but he calls it a horrible thought. So those are the 4 main points that you get from this scene. You have the audio YouTube video, and you also have the PDF version of the play. So if you would like to listen to scene 3, it's going to be in the Shakespeare version, so make sure you're following along with the left-hand side of the